There is a quiet assumption shaping much of modern life that a meaningful inner life is something we eventually arrive at once the external conditions are right, when there is enough time, enough success, enough space. But what often goes unnoticed is that the inner life does not emerge as a byproduct of accumulation. In many cases, it recedes because of it. We become fluent in building outward structures, careers, identities, systems of productivity, but remain largely uninitiated in constructing something inward that can hold stillness, contradiction, or even boredom without resistance. And so, there is a subtle tension. We have more access than ever, yet less intimacy with our own experience. Much of what surrounds us is designed to keep attention moving toward the next input, the next response, the next small sense of progress. Stillness, in contrast, has no obvious reward. It does not signal achievement. It does not accumulate. And because of that, it is often postponed, not consciously, but repeatedly. What begins to fade is not intelligence or capability, but a certain kind of inner companionship, the ability to sit within one's own mind without immediately trying to edit, escape, or optimize it. Today's conversation is an attempt to sit with that absence, not to resolve it quickly, but to understand what it means to build an inner life that isn't dependent on what can be acquired, optimized, or displayed. Something quieter, something that cannot be bought, and perhaps cannot even be fully explained, only noticed over time, and moments where nothing in particular is happening, and yet something essential is present. When you observe the texture of modern life, the pace, the constant exposure to information, the subtle pressure to remain visible and engaged, what do you feel makes the idea of an inner life feel distant, or even slightly unfamiliar, to many people today?
I think it begins with where attention is being trained, almost invisibly. For most people, attention rarely rests inward for long. It is gently, but persistently, directed outward toward updates, conversations, expectations, and a kind of ongoing participation in the visible world. Over time, this creates a habit where the inner space is not just neglected, but gradually becomes less accessible, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer practiced. There is also a quiet shift in what is valued. What can be seen, measured, or responded to tends to feel more real. The inner life, by contrast, does not present itself in ways that can be easily shared or validated. It has no immediate proof of existence, and so it begins to feel secondary, even optional. Another layer is discomfort. When there is no external input, what remains is often unstructured. Thoughts do not arrive in clean sequences. Emotions are not always coherent. There can be a certain ambiguity to simply being with oneself. Without familiarity, that ambiguity is often interpreted as something to fix or move away from. So instead, people stay engaged, not always out of desire, but because engagement provides a kind of orientation. It tells you where you are, who you are in relation to others, and what matters in the moment. The inner life does not offer that kind of immediate clarity. It unfolds more slowly, and sometimes not at all, in ways that feel definitive. Over time, this creates a subtle distance, not an active rejection, but a kind of forgetting that there is a dimension of experience that does not require input, reaction, or visibility to exist. And because it is forgotten, it begins to feel unfamiliar. Not foreign, exactly, but slightly out of reach.
Do you feel that people are consciously aware of this absence, this distance from their own inner life, or does it tend to surface in more indirect, almost unnameable ways? Perhaps as a kind of background unease that doesn't immediately point to its source.
In most cases, it doesn't arrive as a clear recognition. It is rarely articulated as, "I feel disconnected from my inner life." The language for that is not readily available, and even when it is, it tends to feel abstract. Instead, it shows up in ways that are harder to locate precisely. A kind of restlessness is often the first signal. Not an urgent anxiety, but a low, persistent sense that something is slightly off. The day can be full, even productive, and yet there is a subtle lack of settlement within it. People may move from one activity to another without much resistance, but also without a sense of arrival. Another way it appears is in the relationship to silence. When there is a pause, no input, no conversation, no immediate task, it can feel unexpectedly uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong in that moment, but because there is no familiar structure to lean on. So the instinct is to feel it, to reach for something that restores a sense of orientation, even if only briefly. There is also a certain difficulty in staying with one's own thoughts. Not because the thoughts are necessarily overwhelming, but because they feel uncontained. If you don't get into the habit of watching them, they can seem either too random to follow or too boring to pay attention to. So they're skipped over instead of looked into. This distance can cause a pattern where people feel things but don't fully process them. There is a response, but not much thought. Feelings come and go quickly, and the next stimulus often comes before they have time to settle into understanding. Over time, this leads to a kind of internal unfamiliarity. Not a dramatic disconnection, but a quiet sense that one's own experience is happening at a slight distance, close enough to function, but not close enough to be deeply known. And because this is subtle, it is easy to normalize. It becomes the baseline, rather than something that calls for attention.
In your own experience, or in what you've observed in others, when someone begins even in a very small, almost tentative way to turn their attention inward and spend time with their own thoughts and in our landscape, what seems to shift first, and how does that shift tend to unfold over time?
What shifts first is not clarity, but exposure. When we focus on ourselves, even for a short time, we can often see the density that was already there, the thoughts that aren't finished, the subtle tensions, and the patterns that have been repeating without our noticing. It can feel less like discovery and more like encountering something that has been waiting. And because of that, the initial response is often resistance. There is a sense that this is not leading anywhere useful, or that it is unnecessarily heavy. The mind, which is used to moving outward toward resolution or distraction, finds it difficult to remain in a space where nothing is being solved. But if the attention holds, even gently, something begins to change, not in the content of thought, but in the relationship to it. Instead of being immediately carried by each thought or reaction, there is a slight pause, a gap where observation becomes possible. Thoughts are still present, but they are no longer identical with the one who is experiencing them. This makes a space of sorts, and in that space, patterns start to show up, not by looking at them closely, but by doing them over and over. Certain concerns, certain interpretations, and certain emotional responses appear again and again, and over time, they become more recognizable. There is less surprise in them. With that recognition comes a quiet slowing down. Reactions are not as immediate. There is a moment, sometimes very brief, where one can sense the movement of a thought or feeling before fully entering it. This does not remove difficulty, but it changes its texture. What was once automatic becomes, at least partially, visible. And over time, this visibility leads to a different kind of familiarity, not with outcomes, but with one's own inner patterns. The mind becomes less of a place to manage and more of a place to notice. It is a subtle shift, but it alters the experience of being within oneself. Not by making it easier, but by making it less opaque.
When people begin to consider the idea of cultivating an inner life, what do you sense is most commonly misunderstood about that process, perhaps in the way it is imagined, approached, or even expected to feel over time?
One of the most common misunderstandings is the idea that looking inside yourself will quickly make things clear. People think that if they spend time thinking, watching, or just being with their thoughts, something clear will come out of it, like a solution, an idea, or a sense of direction. And when that does not happen, or happens only in fragments, it can feel as though the process is not working. But the inner life does not operate with that kind of linearity. It does not move from question to answer in a predictable way, or fun. It deepens the question instead. It brings forward layers that were not initially visible, which can feel like moving further away from certainty rather than toward it. Another misunderstanding is the idea that cultivating an inner life requires stepping away from the world in a visible or dramatic way. People imagine withdrawal or less engagement, fewer responsibilities, a kind of separation. But what tends to shift is not the structure of one's life, but the quality of attention within it. The same external activities can continue, but they are experienced with a different kind of presence. People also get confused between thinking too much and looking inside themselves. They may seem alike on the surface because they both involve focusing on one's thoughts. But overthinking usually happens over and over again because you want to solve or control something. It goes around the same points, and they often get tighter. When introspection is more grounded, it has a different feel. It allows thoughts to appear without immediately trying to organize or conclude them. There is less urgency, even when the content is complex. Finally, there is the subtle belief that the inner life is something to be mastered, that with enough attention, one can arrive at a stable, well-understood internal state. But in practice, it remains fluid. There are periods of clarity and periods where things feel less accessible again. The shift is not toward control, but toward familiarity. A willingness to remain in contact with what is present, even when it does not resolve into something clear.
If we begin to consider the inner life as something that can be shaped not through force or discipline alone, but through a more attentive, almost careful relationship with one's own thoughts and experiences, what begins to change when it is approached with care rather than control.
The shift from control to care changes the tone of the entire inner environment. When the impulse is to control, there is often an underlying assumption that something within needs to be corrected, organized, or improved. Thoughts are evaluated quickly, emotions are either justified or resisted. There is a subtle pressure to arrive somewhere more stable, more coherent. Care introduces a different orientation. It does not begin with the need to alter what is present. It begins with allowing it to be seen more fully. This creates a slower pace internally, where experiences are not immediately translated into problems. There is a kind of patience that enters. Not passive, but receptive. Thoughts are not interrupted as quickly. Emotions are not reduced to labels as soon as they appear. There is more time given for something to reveal its shape before it is interpreted. In that space, complexity becomes easier to hold. Conflicting emotions, incomplete thoughts, and ambiguous motivations can exist simultaneously without necessitating prompt resolution. This doesn't make things more comfortable, but it does make it easier to deal with the discomfort that comes from trying to make things easier too quickly. Another change is how you deal with patterns that happen over and over. Under control, repetition often feels like failure, something that should have been resolved already. Under care, repetition becomes informative. It points to areas that require attention, not correction. There is less judgment attached to the fact that something has returned. Over time, this softens the internal dialogue. The voice that once pushed for clarity or certainty becomes quieter, or at least less dominant. In its place, there is a more observational presence, one that does not withdraw from difficulty, but also does not escalate it. This does not produce immediate transformation, but it creates a steadier relationship with one's own mind. A sense that whatever arises can be met, not managed. And within that, there is a subtle form of stability, not because everything is understood, but because it no longer needs to be controlled in order to be endured.
In a world more focused on speed, visibility, and continual connection than ever before, it seems like this new way of relating to yourself, finding calm in yourself, zero judgment, can sometimes be considered a clarity.
Because it is rare to find around us, it seems like clarity, not necessarily in the sense of being unattainable, but rather because there are so few natural conditions that lend themselves to it. Most spaces are made to support function through movement towards something, be it again a task, a response, or continuing something, etc., and there is always something in the environment calling for attention. There's also a lot of immediate feedback given when dispersed. To remain inwardly steady within that requires a kind of non-participation in that momentum, at least for moments at a time, and that, in itself, is uncommon. Another key component that is important in any interaction is focused attention. Being able to stay with one thought or feeling for a longer period of time without having your focus immediately shift to something else is becoming more and more uncommon. We constantly have divided, redirected, or transiently interrupted attention. Therefore, when you may settle down for even a brief time, it will have a different energy to it than usual. It feels fuller, not because something extraordinary is happening, but because the experience is not being fragmented. Another aspect is the absence of performance. In today's society, we have to present ourselves and our lives to others and to ourselves in a way that we didn't have to before. We are subconsciously creating the frame for how we interpret our experiences with each other, frame our experiences to one another, and shape our experiences together. But within an inner life that is approached with care, that layer begins to thin. There is less need to position oneself in a particular way. This creates a sense of relief. Although this change is not terribly dramatic, it is easily recognizable. The amount of effort it takes to maintain a certain image, even within yourself, will decrease. Time also changes its character. Without the constant orientation toward what comes next, moments are not measured primarily by their productivity or outcome. You may be allowed to lengthen here and there. You may have something not always immediately filled. This can create a feeling of a much larger time frame, even if, from the outside, your schedule has not changed. Most importantly, you will gain a greater feeling of enoughness. This is not a conclusion, but rather an underlying current. You will begin to develop an understanding that your experience is sufficient as is. It does not have to be improved, supplemented, or escaped from in some way. That it can be inhabited without immediate modification. Where so many things are designed to keep this feeling of enoughness at bay, having some amount of it reside in the world around you carries with it a quiet significance. It is not something you will receive, but rather a sense of not being withheld.
When somebody takes a moment apart from all of the commotion and distraction that usually surrounds them and just sits in silence and stillness with themselves without attempting to analyze, assert, or change anything, they may find that they begin to notice other things about their own inner world, potentially over time.
Initially, they may realize that this stillness is strange for them, not necessarily in a strongly uncomfortable way, but in a non-structured way. Because there is nothing against which attention can be held or engaged, the attention will have difficulty finding a resting place. The urge to grab, reach for something to fill the void, and create some sort of purpose for the minute will be subtle at best. If this urge passes even slightly, what will begin to emerge in the empty space is the movement that has been there all along. Thoughts appear, often in fragments. Some will appear to be repetitive, others are incomplete. They will not arrive in a systematic way, and thus do not have a defined meaning upon immediate inspection. It may feel like an observation of a process which has typically gone unnoticed in the background of life. Simultaneously, there are likely to be emotional tones that are quieter than expected. Again, not being overly intense or dramatic, similarly, being present in a less definable way, such as a degree of tension or discomfort, or a kind of low-level fatigue. Even at the same time, a calmness that feels strange due to the absence of movement compared to earlier activities. It's easy to see the flow of experience itself, rather than time, through the transformation of individual events into unbroken sequences. Experiences flow into each other seamlessly, and within the flow, we gradually become aware that we can freely experience thoughts without any obligation to develop those thoughts. A feeling can be sensed without being defined. There is a softening in the need to engage with each element. Over time, this can reveal a quieter layer beneath the activity. Not something separate, but something that was previously obscured by constant movement. A sense of presence that does not depend on what is happening, but remains as things change. It is not immediately stable. Attention still moves, thoughts still pull. But there are brief moments where the distance between experience and awareness becomes visible. And in those moments, there is less urgency. There may not be a resolution for every thought. However, during the time of non-resistance, one has the ability to simply experience without needing to find a resolution to any particular thought. What ultimately may be perceived is not the creation of anything new, but the perception of something that has always existed.
Perhaps the inner life is not something we construct in the usual sense. It may already exist quiet, continuous, and largely unnoticed beneath the surface of activity. What we often call absence may simply be inattention. What will become apparent to you, and your willingness to stay with your inner experience without needing to change, does not change. Rather, your perception of your inner experience will grow. In a way, this is an understated way of experiencing clarity. It is not in adding more, but in no longer moving away from it. not in achieving clarity all at once, but in allowing experience to unfold without interruption. And perhaps, over time, that is enough to recognize that nothing essential was missing, only overlooked.